Hello, my name is Paul Salisbury from the Australian office in Taipei, and I'm here today to participate in the 2020 International Sports Affairs training course. Today, I'd like to talk to you about sports diplomacy, in particular, Australia's sports diplomacy strategy. So we're asking ourselves, what role can sports play in diplomacy, in international relations? So I'd like to start with a brief quote from Nelson Mandela. Some of you may know. And he said, "Sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair." So these are very powerful words, and you may know that South Africa had a long history of racial tensions called apartheid, and sport actually played a very important role in forcing South Africa to lift some of its restrictions on apartheid. Many international sporting teams refused to play in South Africa as a way to protest against these policies. So it's an example, South Africa provides a very good example of the way that sports and diplomacy can interact together. So that's just a brief introduction to some of the ideas that I would like to introduce today during this course. There will actually be two parts to the presentation. The first part will be a brief, I'll provide a brief introduction on these slides, and then the second part will move to a panel discussion, a question and answer discussion, where we can raise and talk about some of the issues that I've raised during my presentation. Okay. This is a brief outline of the way in which I plan to present the course today. So I will start out introducing myself, and then I think we need to arrive at a definition, an understanding of what we mean by sports diplomacy. Then I'd like to move on to providing a few examples of the ways in which Australia has used sports diplomacy to date. I provided 3 different examples, 3 different areas, 3 different sports that I can introduce of ways in which Australia and the Australian government has used sport through the medium of sport to promote cooperation with other countries. In the fourth part of my presentation, then I would like to introduce what we call Australia's Sports Diplomacy Strategy 2030. So this was introduced last year by the Australian government as a major initiative to promote sport as a diplomatic policy objective up until 2030. So we have a very comprehensive strategy that incorporates sports into our foreign affairs approach. And then finally, I'd like to draw some points from my conclusion, looking forwards into what we can do together to cooperate in this area of sports diplomacy. As I mentioned before, after my presentation, I will then move on to a question and answer session, who is the Deputy Secretary General of Chinese Taipei Olympic Committee. I will now briefly provide an introduction, self-introduction. So as I explained before, I'm from the Australian office in Taipei. I'm the Deputy Director, and I've been working in the Australian office for about 6 months. As part of my duties, I'm also responsible for sports collaboration and sports cooperation with Taiwan, but also with other countries in the region. So this particular topic, this area, is very important to me, and I'm really looking forward in the next 3 to 4 years that I have working here in Taiwan to promote greater cooperation with our Taiwanese friends in the area of sports diplomacy. Now, I myself am a very avid sports person. I've enjoyed many sports growing up, particularly swimming and athletics. I also enjoy traveling very much, and I've visited about 50 different countries around the world. I've been very fortunate though in that one of my main passions is actually cycling. I'm a very keen cyclist, so that's one of the reasons why I'm very glad that I've been able to come and work here in Taiwan, because it's a fantastic place to ride a bicycle. But I have a very strong passion for cycling, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to represent Australia in cycling in different fields. So I've represented Australia in track cycling. It's indoor cycling in a velodrome at the elite level, and also in road cycling at the masters level. So I've been fortunate enough there to travel overseas to represent Australia. Last year I was in Poland, the year before that in Italy, and then the year before that in France in the World Championships. So I'm very, very passionate about cycling. And I was also, in 2017, I was the Australian national champion in the Masters division in track cycling. So once again in a velodrome inside. You may have seen that it's an Olympic event. So yeah, it's a fantastic way to meet lots of new people. I've had chances to interact with, particularly with Japan, because I was previously working in Japan in the Australian Embassy in Tokyo. So in my job there, I worked with the Japan Olympic Committee to help promote sports collaboration between cyclists, Australian and Japanese cyclists. So I helped Japanese Olympic cyclists to go to Australia to train, and also helped Australian cyclists to come to Japan to compete. From this year, I've also been fortunate enough to help with Australian cyclists coming to compete in the Tour de Taiwan, which was here in March this year. It was one of the few events on the international cycling calendar which has actually gone ahead. Because of the situation with COVID-19, most of the competitions around the world have all been postponed. But because Taiwan has such an excellent control of the situation, the Tour de Taiwan went ahead in March this year. It was a fantastic result, and we had a number of Australian teams coming to compete, and they did very well as well. So it was a fantastic outcome, and that's the start of things that I'd like to be promoting further. Australian sports people athletes coming to Taiwan and competing, and also helping Taiwanese athletes travel to Australia, travel to other areas around the world to develop their careers and compete internationally. I have a few pictures here which I can sort of refer to my sporting career to date. So I mentioned before that I was the 2017 Masters track champion. So this is track cycling. This is called the individual pursuit. So this was competing in a velodrome. This is competing in road race. This particular one is in Japan. I'm actually on a Japanese cycling team because I used to live in Japan before. As I said, I used to work in the Australian Embassy in Tokyo. So this is actually my Japanese team. That's our coach, and these are my teammates. So this is competing internationally. And I still look forward to competing with them again. I also mentioned that I traveled and cycled in Taiwan as well. So you might know this is the Taiwan Kom Challenge, which is in Hehuashan, in Wuling. So that was last year. It was a fantastic place. As I said before, Taiwan is an amazing country for cyclists. It's got some of the best cycling I've ever had. I've been to many countries around the world, including this is in Italy. But I can say that Taiwan has some of the best places for cycling anywhere in the world. It's fantastic. So these are just a few examples. I also was fortunate enough to be involved in sports diplomacy in Japan, as I mentioned previously. And this is actually from a TV show which I did about cycling in Japan. So it's called Cycle Around Japan. And I was just going to play a very brief video for you to see some of the things which I've been doing to date to promote sports and sports diplomacy in other countries. So this particular video, which I'll play now, is based around Nagano Prefecture in Japan. So we did a promotional video to help use cycling to help promote Japan, the Japanese countryside. So I'll briefly play this for you.
The best way to discover the secret places, the real Japan, is to go exploring by bicycle.
So this show introduces the Japanese different parts of Japan by traveling around on a bicycle.
Climbing the steep passes through the high mountains of the Japanese Alps.
Wow, the view down the valley below, this is sensational.
Breathtaking vistas wait at the top of each pass. We'll see how people developed lifestyles best adapted to these highlands. We'll enjoy foods grown in some of Japan's purest water. And encounter traditional crafts, still practiced in remote mountain villages.
結構力いりますね。これ失敗ですか?
A 330-kilometer ride through the vivid greens of early summer, exploring the unique history and culture of Nagano. Come with us on a ride no one's taken before.
So, as I said, this particular video was one that introduced through cycling as a way to introduce a foreign audience to Japan and also help to improve their understanding of Japanese traditions and culture. So it's a good way. They're also using it as a way to promote ecotourism in Japan. Lots of foreign tourists want to travel there and see the countryside by bicycle. So it's another good way to help promote relations between the two countries, promote understanding. So it's just one example of the way in which sports can be used as a diplomatic tool. Okay? Now, I wanted to move on, as I said, to reach some sort of understanding or definition of what we mean by sports diplomacy. as you might know, one of the key things about sports is that it's often considered to be a universal language, so that it doesn't have any cultural barriers. So often when people can't communicate through words, they can communicate through sports. They can understand one another, and that's what we mean by saying that sports is a universal language. So it's often a very, very useful way to communicate with people. You can do that through sports. So that's one way that we can understand sports diplomacy as a means of communication. Another point is values. So the values which are promoted and developed in sport, a few examples are competition, teamwork, fair play, leadership. These types of values are very, very useful in diplomacy because they help build trust and they help bring people together. So that's why not only is it a form of communication, sports is also important in terms of developing key values which are important in building trust, strengthening bonds between countries. And also it's important to know that sport can help advance our interests, project our values and our identity, and serve as a bridge between peoples, communities and nations. So in Australia, Australians are mad about sports. People often say that sports are in our blood, it's part of our DNA. It's a very, very crucial part of our identity. And the way that we present ourselves on the sports field is a way of projecting our values as, in my case, as Australians, as projecting our identity as Australians. So it's through sports, once again, we can use sports to project who we are and what we mean and help other people understand that better and build better communication, understanding and cooperation. So these are different ways in which sports can be used to promote diplomacy, and there are three different sort of understandings of what we mean when we say sports diplomacy. Now, I wanted to give you a few examples of sports diplomacy to maybe to help you sort of understand a bit better what I was talking about, those different terms. So when we actually see sports diplomacy in action, it might help you realize the important role that sports can play. Now, one of the most famous examples is what it was called ping pong diplomacy or table tennis diplomacy. So this was in 1971, and this was a time when the United States and China were still, there was many tensions between those two countries, and they set up a number of table tennis matches. I think there were about 8 different matches in 1971. And through these matches, through the organization that was required to organize these matches, it brought the two countries closer together and enabled their diplomats to start talking to one another. Up until that point, there hadn't been a lot of communication. And then in 1972, that was when the United States was actually, the president was able to travel to Beijing, and that actually launched the start of their relationship, their formal relationship. So that's a very clear example that between China and the United States. Another example, similarly from the Cold War, is between Canada and what was then the USSR, so it's now Russia, in 1972. Both countries are very strong at ice hockey, and similarly, they did not have very good diplomatic relations in the 1970s. It was the height of the Cold War. They used ice hockey matches, a number of ice hockey matches in 1972 that enabled their diplomats to start talking to one another again. So they're two examples from the Cold War. A few more recent examples. A very good one is what was called cricket diplomacy. In Taiwan, you may not know what we mean by cricket, but it's similar to baseball. But it's a game that originated from Britain and is played in many countries that used to have strong links with Britain, including Pakistan and India. Now, these two countries have had some misunderstandings in the past, territorial disputes, and they haven't played cricket against one another for a very long time. But in 2011, they established a tour where they would play cricket matches in one another's countries. And once again, through cricket, they were able to improve understanding of one another's positions, and that helped ease some of the tensions between the two countries. So in that case, it was cricket that served as the vehicle for diplomatic, two diplomatic sides being able to reach a better understanding of one another's positions. I can give you another, probably maybe more pertinent, closer example, and it relates to Korea, South Korea and North Korea. You might know that the two Olympic teams from those two countries have, on a number of occasions, they have actually marched together at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games. So that first happened in Sydney in 2000, then in Athens 2004, and then in the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. So this is a photo of that opening ceremony in Pyeongchang where they were marching together, and they marched under a unified Korean flag. So this is the flag that you can see there that has the two countries joined together. So that's a closer, more recent example. And finally, I'd like to just draw one other example, which I think is very, very important, which is underlies some of the key work done by the International Olympic Committee, and that relates to the Refugee Olympic team. So this was in Rio in 2016, and it was the first time ever for a team of refugees to be able to represent themselves as refugees in the Olympics. And it was a milestone. This was in Rio in 2016, and it showed the way that sports can be used to build better understanding, help people understand the situations of refugees around the world, but also give refugees a chance to improve their lives. So I'd like to briefly introduce a program, a short video that explains this initiative by the International Olympic Committee to promote a refugee Olympic team. So, as I mentioned before, it's based around the Olympic Refuge Foundation, and it uses sports-based projects to support refugee populations across the world. And it's very much focused on protecting, developing and empowering children and youth in vulnerable situations. Many of these refugees, many of them are, the vast majority of them are actually children, and they are very vulnerable. They live in very dangerous situations. There's often wars going nearby, and their safety is a paramount concern. They actually don't have, many of them don't have opportunities to play in places which are safe. So providing a safe refuge for them to play and engage in sports is a key part of this initiative. But also its hopes to improve the lives of these young refugees through sport, to help them develop skills such as leadership and cooperation that they can then use to build their future careers. So yeah, I'd like to now introduce a short video that explains some of the work that is being done by the Olympic Refuge Foundation. So as you can see, many of the children in these war-affected areas, and this is a refugee camp.
The number of refugees and displaced people is the highest on record, 65.3 million. That's 1 in every 113 people worldwide. More than half are under the age of 18. People think being a refugee or displaced is temporary. The reality is all too permanent. In light of this continuing crisis, the IOC will scale up its long-standing partnership with UNHCR to use sport to protect and invest in young people and drive social transformation. The refugee Olympic team competing at the Olympic Games in Rio de Janeiro in 2016 was a huge step. The Olympic Refuge Foundation is the next long-term commitment by the IOC to the displaced people of the world. The foundation will create safe, basic, accessible sports facilities where young people will be welcome to participate in sports activities that will improve their daily lives. Sport will become a positive agent for change in refugee settlements and disadvantaged communities. Specifically adapted sports programs will impart invaluable life skills such as self-confidence, leadership, conflict resolution, and decision-making at a community and personal level. The programs will encourage inclusion, empathy, mutual understanding, friendship, and respect. This specialized sports curriculum will be developed in collaboration with local communities to fulfill their needs and ensure ownership and long-term sustainability. Recognized NGOs will ensure the implementation of the programs on the ground. The Olympic Refuge Foundation will act as a platform from which other stakeholders can operate and contribute. Members of the Olympic movement, governments, international organizations, the private sector, and individual philanthropists can work together to realize sustainable programs that affect real change. This is not about creating champions. It is about creating hope. A safe place to play sport is a pathway to social, physical, and emotional well-being. The Olympic Refuge Foundation is an opportunity to stand up for the displaced, to be on the right side of history, to lead the way, to fight for those who need it most using the powerful tool of sport that enriches so many lives. Join us.
So, as you can see, for many refugees around the world, they actually don't even have the opportunity to play sports, and having a safe place where they can engage in sport and play with their friends is really important. So in the video, they mentioned that more than 50% of people in refugee camps are under 18. And many of these are in war-affected regions, places like Syria or Turkey, for example. There's many places in Africa as well. And the idea of this particular project is to create a safe place for these children to play sport, and through sport, develop their confidence and develop new skills. Self-confidence is very important, but also teamwork, cooperation, leadership skills. All of these things are things that can be promoted through sport, and this particular initiative by the International Olympic Committee is a great example of sports diplomacy and the way that we can use sports in international relations to build friendships, to build communities, to build people's futures. You saw they said the goal was not to create champions, but to create hope. I think that's an important thing to remember, that sport is very important in terms of the values that it's able to promote amongst peoples. So there were just a few examples of what we mean when we talk about sports diplomacy. What I wanted to introduce now was some examples of Australia's own sports diplomacy. So what I'm going to do is first talk about some previous examples, so things that the Australian government has done to date, And then in the second part, I'll introduce our future goals, our future projects looking forward. So firstly, turning to some examples of sports diplomacy by Australia to date. I've picked out 3 different examples. And when I've used a sporting analogy that we often use in Australia, which is kicking goals. So that means achieving outcomes. You might understand kicking a goal in soccer is one example, but we also have another game which is very popular in Australia, which is called Australian rules football, or what we call Aussie rules. And this particular reference is to playing Australian rules football. So when we say kicking goals for something in Australia, everybody knows we're actually talking about sports, but it's a way that sports has been integrated into our daily lives. So there's 3 examples here. I'm going to talk firstly about what's called the Pacific Sports Partnership, which is one of our main initiatives in sports diplomacy. Then I'm going to talk about a particular initiative that focuses on women and girls in sports through Australian football, which is what I briefly mentioned, and it's in Nauru. So it's a very important place both for Australia and for Taiwan. And then finally, I'll give a brief introduction about another initiative in Papua New Guinea. So that I've written there as PNG, so Papua New Guinea, which is just to the north of Australia, and that's promoting rugby league. Once again, there's a very heavy focus, a strong focus in Australia's sports diplomacy on girls, on women and girls. We're very, very keen to promote sports, use sports as a way to help empower women and girls, because often they're the ones in disadvantaged communities that don't have an opportunity to play sports. For many reasons, it might be cultural or historical reasons, they're discouraged from playing sports. So creating programs which encourages them to participate and values that participation is a way not only to help promote sports, but also to empower them and alleviate some of the discrimination that they experience to date. So you'll see in all the examples that I introduce, there's a heavy focus for Australia on promoting girls and women in sports. And also it's often in sports which are traditionally seen to be male sports. Okay, so things like rugby or rugby league, football, these types of tough sports. It's great to see women athletes performing strongly and being role models for girls for the future. So that's why I've picked these 3 examples. The first, what I will do initially is introduce a short video about the specific sports partnership.
The first strike of the wind came to the island, pull my head, pull my leg. When my knees, I feel my knees on my chest, hit the ground. The program is give me purpose in many ways. Deep inside me, I'm so proud.
has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has the power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where once there was only despair.
It changes my perspective on life.
Just believe in yourself. If I can do it, you can do it.
So you may have seen in the video, it introduced a number of very important themes for our sports diplomacy. As I mentioned before, it was a focus on women and girls. That's a very heavy focus. There was also a brief mention of disability. So this is another aspect of, in many disadvantaged communities, people with disability face heavy discrimination. And sport is actually a way to empower them, to give them hope, and often through sports they can overcome their disabilities. You saw some athletes there with amputations and things. So it's a chance for these athletes to develop their confidence and develop key skills. So helping disabled athletes is also a key focus. Another aspect is health. So as we know, people who engage in sports are generally healthier. So encouraging sports in different types of communities is a way to improve health and alleviate a lot of pressure on medical systems, health and hospital systems. In the Pacific in particular, which is a major focus of Australia's aid programs, and this Pacific Sports Partnership is part of that. In the Pacific, health issues are very important, and combating non-communicable diseases such as diabetes is actually a major benefit of sports diplomacy. So in places like Samoa or Tonga, actually the diabetes is a very serious issue. It has the highest death rates from diabetes in the world, these countries. So helping people to encouraging people to adopt healthy lifestyles through sport is a way to help combat these types of diseases. So there are just a few examples of some of the major sort of foci within our sports diplomacy program through that example of the specific sports partnership. So as I mentioned, it's a flagship sports development program in the Pacific for Australia. Our sports diplomacy once again has quite a heavy focus on the Pacific because they're our neighbouring countries, and relations with those countries are very important to Australia. And it's also a region in which we think we can do a lot through sport with sports diplomacy. So I know for our Taiwanese friends, the Pacific nations are also important. So I'm hoping in the future that there's a chance to work together to promote sports and sports diplomacy in the Pacific. So as I said, this Pacific Sports Partnership Program, one of the focuses is to combat non-communicable diseases, things like diabetes, for example, and to address inequalities experienced by women, girls, and people living with disabilities. And it's coordinated through the Australian government and Australian sports organisations, and cooperation with regional and specific Pacific Island sports organisations. Currently, the partnership, the program, supports 13 sports across 6 countries. And I've just got a brief table here which explains the sports and the countries which are involved. So I'll just point them out to you. So AFL is, as I mentioned before, is actually a shortened form for Australian football. I've got a video about that to briefly explain what that is later on. But as you can see, there's a number of different sports that we're promoting. Some of them are probably quite familiar to you, like, for example, baseball, swimming, tennis, but others such as cricket or AFL, maybe not so. But it's sports which are very popular in the Pacific. Things like rugby league, rugby union are very popular. And another important one to point out is one called netball, which you may not know, but it's similar to basketball, but very, very popular for girls and women. So that's why we're promoting netball partnerships in places like Papua New Guinea, Samoa and Tonga. So that's just a brief introduction to the types of sports and the countries that are participating in this Pacific Sports Partnership Program. So that's something that's been going from about 2015, and we've got the first phase of the program is finishing up and we're moving into the second phase. So it's been very successful. We've had a lot of really good feedback, and it's a great way in which we can build friendships and understanding with our friends in the Pacific. The next example that I'd like to draw on briefly is another one I mentioned before, Australian football. And that's often called, in Australia, we use the words AFL to describe that type of football. And this particular example is in Nauru. And we had a number of female players, female athletes from a famous Australian football team called the Adelaide Crows. So they won the championship last year in their competition. They went and visited Nauru and did a number of seminars. And one of the key objectives of this particular program was to give young girls role models for strong leaders, strong women leaders in sport. So in Nauru, often it's very hard for young girls to have role models in sport. This was a great opportunity for them to see some of their idols. The sport of Australian football is very popular in Nauru. And you can see in the video, you can see even though Nauru is a very, very small country, this attracted the attention of the whole country, and including the Prime Minister. Many people came to visit and take part in this particular activity. So it's a brief video explaining a visit by some players from the Adelaide Crows, 3 women from the championship team, to give some clinics about Australian football in Nauru.
Summoned by the AFL and the Australian High Commission to spread the word of women's football and promote physical activity among girls in Nauru, the 3 Adelaide Crows premiership stars could certainly pull a crowd.
They were just clapping and stuff as soon as we got off the plane. Felt like I was royalty.
Nauru's population is only 11,000, but in men's and women's senior competitions, junior grades and Auskick, 3,000 of them play football.
They live and breathe AFL just like we do here in Australia.
And they do it on one rock-strewn football field
so about
next to an abandoned chemical
40%
processing
of Nauru's
plant.
population
Football oval is just
plays
white gravel
Australian
rocks,
football.
and it doesn't stop them from tackling just as hard.
I'm really afraid that one of them's going to tackle me. I'm going to draw some blood.
While on Nauru, the Crows trio coordinated clinics,
Oh, we've got a good group here though. Pretty good footy.
ran a football warm-up session for 300 children at an athletics carnival,
It was just organised chaos, but they just had so much fun and so many smiles, and we're just so excited to meet us.
and added their own touch to the Nauru National Karate Championships. They even had time for a spot of fishing.
Pretty incredible, I guess. We had some great feedback from the Australian High Commissioner and the President of Nauru as well, just the value and the importance of just seeing some strong, independent, female footballers walking around town. I remember speaking to a young girl, and she was only 11 years old, and that was the same age that I started playing footy, and she was playing footy with the boys, and she was just so excited to see that it was possible, and you could see it in her face. It's difficult for me to probably get my head around how the impact that you actually do have, because I guess I'm just a girl that loves her footy and plays, and I think the bonus is that if it can help impact other people that's pretty cool.
By the time Randall, Foley and Gore were ready to leave the island, an entire country knew their names.
So this was just one example, and as some of the players said in the video, it was great to talk to young girls in Nauru who saw them as their idols and said that it was they'd never seen such strong, independent women, sports people in Nauru, and have presenting that, giving these young girls role models and inspiring them to pursue sports and pursue careers, develop their careers into the future. So that was just another example. The final example that I wanted to draw on is in Papua New Guinea. This particular sports initiative, it's called League Belong Life, which is in the local language means league or rugby league is a part of life. So league belongs to life. So this particular program is very unique in that it combines sports with literacy. So in Papua New Guinea, 30% of children do not finish primary school. Okay, so one of the ideas of this program was through sport, encouraging children to stay in school longer and improve their literacy, improve their education. And so the program actually focuses not only on physical skills, but also academic skills. So an example would be using rugby league in storybooks and creating learning materials that are based around sport, because kids are really keen to learn about rugby league, to learn about sport. And so by incorporating sport into their learning materials, encouraging them to stay in school longer. And so this helps not only to develop their personal skills, many of the things that I've mentioned to date, such as leadership, cooperation, teamwork, but also to develop key education skills, literacy, for example. So it's another way in which sports diplomacy can be used to achieve a number of key outcomes, and in this case it was education. So I'll briefly introduce you to a short video, and I should point out that this video was actually made by the local Papua New Guinean TV station. So it gives you a flavour of TV in Papua New Guinea as well, which is probably a bit different to TV in Taiwan. So yeah, I'll just play this short video for you.
League Belong Life coordinators join elementary and primary school teachers in field and classroom activities through the program.
The League Belong Life program is about giving the opportunity to girls and boys to participate in rugby league. And our main primary objective is probably to have educational outcomes, to see that we enhance students' ability in classroom and using rugby league as the vehicle.
The program challenges the perception of rugby league being a male-dominated sport and does so by creating safe, fun and non-competitive opportunities for girls to participate as well.
we're out here today to celebrate, or mark, I should say, National Women's Day. So every day is a day for women, but we think it's important also to mark a day as important for our women in our country.
Female students joined in the various rugby league activities throughout the program this morning. Rugby Long Life program is not only used to teach students to play rugby league, but also teaches them the importance of their education. Teachers say the program has boosted the students, and interest among students in school has improved the standard of learning. Dion Kombang, National, MTV Sports.